The studio lights cast a controlled glow that feels less like television and more like a lecture hall, the kind where uncomfortable truths are expected rather than avoided. Richard Wolff sits calmly, not rushed, not dramatic, yet there is a weight in the way he pauses before speaking, as if inviting the audience to slow down with him. Behind him, the city skyline stretches upward, steel and glass symbols of economic power, while muted screens display numbers, budgets, and historical images that seem to whisper rather than shout. He begins by questioning the phrase itself, national security, not attacking it outright, but carefully pulling it apart, syllable by syllable, asking what it truly means and, more importantly, whom it truly serves. His voice remains steady as he explains that security is often presented as a military problem, a matter of weapons, borders, and threats, yet economics quietly determines which dangers are amplified and which are ignored. As he speaks, images of massive defense factories appear, workers assembling machines designed not to create life, but to manage death. Wolff points out that these factories are often praised as job creators, economic engines that justify their existence through employment statistics. But he asks the audience to consider what kind of economy depends on the continuous preparation for destruction to sustain jobs. He notes that when hospitals need funding or schools require investment, leaders claim budgets are tight, resources scarce, patience necessary. Yet when military contractors request billions, the money appears almost instantly, framed not as spending but as necessity. The contradiction is not accidental, he argues. It is structural, embedded in an economic system where profit-driven enterprises shape political priorities. Wolff leans forward slightly, emphasizing that national security rhetoric often functions as a shield against scrutiny. Once a policy is labeled security-related, debate narrows, dissent becomes suspicious, and economic decisions escape democratic oversight. He explains how fear is monetized, transformed into contracts, subsidies, and guaranteed returns for corporations whose revenues depend on instability. The audience is reminded that many of the largest defense firms experience record profits during periods of conflict or heightened tension, while ordinary citizens are told to accept austerity as patriotic sacrifice. Wolff does not accuse individuals. Instead, he exposes incentives, explaining that when profit is linked to insecurity, insecurity becomes economically rational. The scene deepens as historical footage appears, wars justified as defensive, interventions framed as unavoidable. Wolff narrates how each moment was accompanied by economic arguments promising growth, innovation, and national strength. Yet he contrasts those promises with outcomes: hollow, doubt industrial towns, underfunded public services, and workers whose wages stagnate while productivity rises. He explains that national security spending often creates a distorted economy, one where resources flow upward, away from communities, into corporate boardrooms and financial markets. The weapons may be built domestically, but the benefits are unevenly distributed, reinforcing inequality under the banner of protection. He pauses again, letting the silence do some of the work, then shifts to the idea of opportunity cost. Every dollar spent on armaments is a dollar not spent on housing, healthcare, renewable energy, or education. Wolff explains that true security includes the ability to survive illness without bankruptcy, to send children to quality schools, to live in communities resilient to climate disasters. By these measures, he argues, an economy obsessed with militarization is fundamentally insecure. The irony, he suggests, is that policies meant to defend a nation often weaken the social foundations that make a society worth defending. As the camera tightens, Wolff addresses a common defense of military spending, that it drives technological innovation. He acknowledges that some advances emerge from defense research, but challenges the assumption that this justifies the scale of spending. He asks viewers to imagine what innovations might arise if comparable resources were invested directly in civilian needs. Instead of surveillance systems refined for war, what about public health technologies? Instead of advanced missile guidance, what about sustainable transportation networks? His tone remains analytical, not speculative, grounding each question in economic logic rather than ideology. The visuals shift to charts showing budget growth over decades, military spending climbing steadily even as social programs fluctuate or shrink. Wolff explains that this pattern reflects political power as much as strategic necessity. Defense contractors lobby aggressively, fund campaigns, and shape narratives that equate economic health with military strength. Meanwhile, workers are told that these industries are indispensable to their livelihoods, creating a false choice between peace and employment. Wolff challenges this framing directly, arguing that jobs can be created through constructive production just as effectively, if not more so, than through preparation for war. He then turns to the human dimension, reminding viewers that economic decisions have moral consequences. When national security is defined narrowly, lives become abstract numbers. Collateral damage abroad, budget cuts at home. Wolff insists that economics is never neutral. It reflects values and priorities. An economy that channels vast wealth into weapons while neglecting basic human needs sends a clear message about whose lives matter most. He does not raise his voice, yet the critique lands heavily, amplified by its calm delivery. As the scene approaches its close, Wolff returns to the central question: what are we really securing? Is it the safety of people or the profitability of systems built on fear? He suggests that redefining national security requires confronting uncomfortable truths about capitalism, power, and democracy. The skyline behind him glows brighter as evening settles in, a reminder that the economy never sleeps, constantly producing outcomes aligned with its incentive. Wolff ends the scene not with a conclusion but with an invitation to think critically, to question familiar narratives, and to recognize that economic choices made in the name of security shape the future far more profoundly than most are encouraged to admit. The atmosphere subtly shifts as Richard Wolff transitions from analysis to response, not defensively, but with a measured confidence that suggests he has heard these criticisms many times before. He acknowledges, almost gently, the accusations that inevitably follow arguments like his, that questioning military spending weakens the nation, that redefining national security sounds naive in a dangerous world, that economics should step aside when survival is at stake. Wolff does not dismiss these fears. Instead, he treats them as symptoms of a deeper problem, one where fear itself has been cultivated as a governing tool. He explains that when people are taught to equate criticism with disloyalty, meaningful debate becomes impossible, and democracy quietly erodes behind declarations of unity. He looks directly into the camera, and reframes patriotism, arguing that loyalty to a nation should mean loyalty to its people rather than to its most profitable industries. True national strength, he says, is not measured by the number of weapons stockpiled, but by the capacity of a society to care for its members in times of crisis. He cites moments when non-military threats exposed deep vulnerabilities, economic collapses, public health emergencies, environmental disaster, events that no missile system could prevent. These, Wolff argues, are security failures every bit as real as foreign aggression, yet they receive a fraction of the resources and urgency. Visuals begin to show alternative paths, not as utopian dreams, but as concrete possibilities. Wolff discusses budgets not as abstract spreadsheets, but as moral documents, records of what a society chooses to protect. He describes how redirecting even a portion of military expenditure could transform infrastructure, create millions of jobs, and reduce dependence on fragile global supply chains. Energy independence through renewables, he notes, would enhance security far more effectively than guarding oil routes with warships. Public health care systems would make populations resilient, reducing panic and instability in times of crisis. These are not soft ideals, he insists, but hard strategies grounded in economic evidence. Anticipating another common objection, Wolff addresses the claim that a reduced military footprint invites aggression. He counters by explaining that an economy organized around permanent readiness for war often escalates tensions rather than deterring them. When military dominance becomes central to economic survival, diplomacy weakens, compromise appears costly, and conflict becomes normalized. He argues that nations investing heavily in human development, cooperation, and mutual economic stability often face fewer security threats because they are less invested in zero-sum outcomes. Security, in this view, emerges from interdependence rather than intimidation. The discussion deepens as Wolff explores how the concept of national security has been used historically to suppress labor movements, silence dissent, and justify surveillance. Economic inequality, he notes, is frequently framed as irrelevant to security, yet extreme inequality destabilizes societies from within. When large segments of the population feel abandoned, distrust grows, institutions lose legitimacy, and social cohesion weakens. Wolff argues that no external enemy is required to threaten a nation already fractured by economic injustice. In this sense, he suggests, ignoring inequality is itself a security risk. He then turns to the global dimension, pointing out that the economics of national security do not stop at national borders. Arms sales, military alliances, and economic sanctions reshape entire regions, often creating cycles of dependency and resentment. Wolff explains that when powerful economies profit from selling weapons or controlling resources, instability abroad becomes a revenue stream rather than a problem to solve. This, he argues, undermines claims of moral leadership and fuels the very threats used to justify continued militarization. Security becomes a business model, not a shared human goal. As the scene progresses, Wolff's tone grows more urgent, though never strident. He emphasizes that economic systems are human creations, not natural laws, and therefore can be changed. The belief that massive military spending is inevitable, he says, reflects learned helplessness rather than reality. Throughout history, societies have reorganized their priorities in moments of clarity, choosing reconstruction over destruction, cooperation over conquest. What is missing today, Wolff suggests, is not knowledge but political will, constrained by concentrated economic power. He addresses viewers not as passive consumers of information, but as participants in the economy itself. Every worker, taxpayer, and voter, he reminds them, is affected by these choices, whether or not they are framed as security issues. When public funds flow disproportionately to defense contractors, citizens pay twice, once through taxes and again through neglected social needs. Wolff urges viewers to recognize their stake in redefining security, to see that questioning priorities is not radical but responsible. As the closing moments approach, the visuals simplify, the charts fading until only Wolff remains against the dim city lights. He summarizes his response not as a rebuttal to critics, but as a challenge to assumptions. National security, he concludes, is too important to be left to generals and corporations alone. It must be reclaimed as a public conversation about what kind of society people want to live in and what risks they are truly facing. He stresses that an economy built to serve human needs reduces fear rather than exploits it, creating stability that no arsenal can guarantee. In the final seconds, Wolff leaves the audience with a thought that lingers beyond the broadcast. If security policies consistently enrich a few while leaving many insecure, then the problem is not a lack of protection, but a misdefinition of what protection means. The camera holds steady as he falls silent, allowing the implication to settle. The economics of national security are choices made every day, and until those choices are confronted, insecurity will continue to be produced in the very name of safety.